Clara Whitmore walked into a stranger's kitchen, lit the stove with shaking hands, and started cooking a meal she had no right to make because it was the only thing left in this world she knew how to do without falling apart. She didn't know whose house it was. She didn't care. She had ridden 3 days on a lie and arrived with nothing but a worn suitcase and a heart somebody had already finished breaking. If you've ever been left standing somewhere you didn't belong, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow Clara all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach from Billings hit Willow Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the dust it kicked up hadn't even settled before Clara Whitmore understood something had gone wrong. She felt it before she saw it. She felt it in the way the driver didn't meet her eyes when he handed down her suitcase. She felt it in the way the handful of people standing near the depot looked at her the way people look at something they weren't expecting and already wished they hadn't seen. She felt it the same way she'd felt every bad thing that had ever happened to her quietly in the chest, like a door shutting in a room you'd already paid to enter. She stood on the platform and looked up and down the main road of Willow Creek, Montana. Thomas Avery was not there. She told herself not to panic. Stagecoaches ran behind schedule. Men got held up with livestock, with fences, with all the ordinary things that pulled a rancher's attention. She set her suitcase down at her feet and folded her hands in front of her and waited because that was what she had learned to do. Clara Whitmore had spent most of her 27 years waiting on something that was supposed to show up and didn't. A boy of maybe 12 came out of the depot office and looked at her sideways. "You Miss Whitmore?" "I am." He held out a folded piece of paper like he was glad to be rid of it. "Man at the general store told me to give you this if a woman got off the coach with a brown suitcase." Clara took the paper. She didn't open it right away. She looked at the boy and gave him a small nod and said, "Thank you kindly," because her mother had raised her to be gracious even when grace was the last thing she felt. The boy ran off. She unfolded the letter. She read it once. Then she read it again slower, because the first time through, she thought she must have misunderstood. She had not misunderstood. Thomas Avery had married another woman 6 days ago. A woman whose family owned the adjoining land. A woman whose father had offered him 300 acres and a water easement that Clara Whitmore, daughter of 2 dead parents, and a modest house in Ohio that had already been sold to pay debts, could never compete with. The letter was not apologetic. It was almost businesslike, the way a man writes when he has decided the person he is writing to does not deserve more than the minimum. He wished her well. He hoped she found suitable accommodation. He was sorry for any inconvenience. Clara folded the letter back along its original creases and put it in the pocket of her brown cotton dress. She picked up her suitcase. She did not cry. She was not going to cry on this platform in front of these people. She had made that decision somewhere between reading the word inconvenience and putting the letter in her pocket. And it was the kind of decision that required everything she had, every last scrap of the dignity she'd spent years trying to hold on to in the face of people who seemed genuinely puzzled by the idea that she deserved any. She walked to the edge of the platform and looked out at Willow Creek. It was not a large town. One main road with a general store, a saloon, a church that needed paint, a livery stable, a land office with a hand-lettered sign, and a scattering of smaller buildings she couldn't identify from where she stood. Mountains in the distance, the color of bruised wood. A sky so big and blue, it felt almost aggressive, like it was daring her to feel small. That the mail-order bride Avery sent for, she heard it clearly. The voice came from 2 women standing near the general store, and they weren't particularly trying to keep it down. Lord, look at her. Thomas must have changed his mind when he saw what was coming. Clara kept her eyes forward. Can't say I blame him. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and reminded herself that she had survived worse than this. She had survived her father's funeral. She had survived her mother's 3 months later. She had survived the look on her cousin Harriet's face when she'd shown up at the family home in Cincinnati after both burials, and Harriet had said without warmth, without any real pretense of welcome, "We don't have a room for you, Clara. You'll have to figure something else out." She had survived all of that. She could survive 2 women outside a general store in a town she'd never intended to spend her life in. She walked toward the land office because it seemed like the kind of place that dealt in practical problems, and what she had right now was a practical problem. She had $3.40 a suitcase, with 2 dresses, and a Bible, and a small tin of her mother's recipe cards, and no plan whatsoever. The man in the land office was thin and wore spectacles, and had the look of someone who handled bad news regularly and had long since stopped being affected by it. "Help you, miss? I'm looking for work," Clara said. "And temporary lodging if there's any to be had. I was brought here under a promise that turned out to be no promise at all, and I need to make a practical arrangement until I can sort out what comes next." He studied her over his spectacles. Not unkindly, but thoroughly. "Not a lot of work in Willow Creek for a woman on her own. Ruthie Pearson over at the boarding house takes in laundry sometimes. Might be a kitchen position at the saloon, but I wouldn't recommend it for a woman of your—" He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "For a woman in your situation. Is there ranching work nearby?" "Ranching? Cooking, housekeeping. I'm capable of hard work, sir. I'm not asking for charity." He took his spectacles off and cleaned them with his handkerchief, which she had already noticed was something men did when they were buying time. "There's Nathan Cole's place about 4 miles northeast. Cole Ranch. Nathan runs it alone since his foreman left last spring. Has his father living with him, older man, not well. Ranch workers eat there, but there's nobody cooking for them regular since his wife passed, and that was—" He paused, doing math. "Going on 3 years now. But Nathan Cole is not an easy man to approach, miss. He doesn't come into town much, keeps to himself. Some people around here think he's— Is he a decent man?" The land office man put his spectacles back on. "Far as I know, he's never been anything but." "Then I'll find him." "Miss, you can't just walk up to a man's ranch and—" "Thank you for your time," Clara said, and picked up her suitcase and walked back out into the afternoon sun. She heard more of it as she moved through town. The whispers weren't even particularly quiet. People in small towns had a way of talking about strangers, like the strangers couldn't hear, or like they simply didn't matter enough to bother lowering their voices for. She heard her size mentioned. She heard the word shame used in a sentence that was very clearly about her. She heard a man outside the saloon say something to his companion that made the companion laugh, and she did not look in their direction, and she did not slow down. She stopped at the general store and spent 15 of her cents on a small portion of dried beef and a piece of bread because she hadn't eaten since the morning stop in Billings. She ate standing at the edge of the road with her suitcase beside her feet methodically, because she needed the energy, and humiliation was not going to prevent her from feeding herself. A shadow fell across her. She looked up. The man was tall, somewhere close to 40, she'd have guessed, with dark hair and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something spare and angular. He wore a brown work coat and had the posture of a man who spent his days doing physical labor and had the quiet that came with it. His hat was plain. His boots were dusty. He was looking at her the way almost nobody in Willow Creek had looked at her yet, not with contempt, not with pity, not with amusement, but with what appeared to be simple, direct attention. The way a person looks at something they're genuinely trying to understand. "You're the woman who came in on the coach," he said. It was not a question. "I am." "Avery left you a letter." "He did." The man looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at her suitcase. Then he looked back at her, and she had the distinct sense he was doing some kind of calculation she wasn't privy to. "Nathan Cole," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. My name, Nathan Cole. I have a ranch northeast of here. I came into town for feed, and I'm heading back shortly." He paused. "I was told at the land office you were asking about ranch work." Clara stared at him. "The man I spoke to not 20 minutes ago sent word to you. He's my cousin's husband. He keeps me informed about things he thinks I'd want to know." Nathan Cole looked at her steadily. "You can cook?" "Yes." "You can manage a house?" Yes. My father is 64 years old and not in good health. He can be difficult. I've managed difficult before. Something moved across Nathan Cole's face. It might have been the beginning of something, some recognition or response, but he kept it brief. I'll be honest with you, Miss Whitmore. Clara Whitmore. Miss Whitmore, I don't have time to be anyone's solution to a personal catastrophe. I need someone who can do the work and do it reliably. I can pay fair wages. You'd have your own room private with a locking door. If after a week either of us decides the arrangement doesn't suit, we part ways with no hard feelings, and I'll personally see you have coach fare to wherever you need to go. Clara looked at him. She thought about the women outside the general store. She thought about Harriet's face in Cincinnati. She thought about Thomas Avery's letter and the word inconvenience. Those are fair terms, she said. Then we should go. I've still got 2 hours of daylight I need. He picked up her suitcase before she could reach for it herself. She didn't protest, but she noticed. She filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered, the small acts that told you more about a person than anything they'd ever say out loud. They rode northeast in near silence, which suited Clara fine. She had no interest in filling silence with chatter, and Nathan Cole clearly had no interest in manufacturing conversation. He drove the wagon with the ease of a man who had made this trip 1,000 times and needed no part of his attention on the road. The land opened up around them into wide grassland with those dark mountains in the distance, and Clara thought it was the most beautiful country she had ever seen, and also the loneliest, and somehow, those two things made complete sense together. How long has your father been at the ranch? She asked, because she needed to know what she was walking into, and asking felt more efficient than wondering. Since my mother died. 11 years. A beat. He wasn't always the way he is now. He's a man who lost the thing that made him who he was, and never quite figured out how to be someone different. Clara was quiet for a moment. And you... Nathan Cole looked at her sideways. And me what? Have you figured out how to be someone different? He turned his eyes back to the road. I reckon that's a question I'm still working on. The ranch came into view as the light was going golden and low. It was a working ranch, clearly large, practical. Nothing decorative about it, but solid and well-maintained in the way that told you the man who ran it cared deeply about keeping things in order, even if he'd stopped caring about much else. There was a main house, a bunkhouse further back, a barn, some outbuildings she couldn't name, and a fence line that stretched out in both directions further than she could see. The ranch hands were finishing up for the day. A few of them looked at Clara when Nathan pulled the wagon up, and there was some of that same sideways assessment she'd been receiving all afternoon, but it was quieter here, less mean, more simply curious. This is Miss Whitmore, Nathan said without inflection. She'll be handling the cooking and the house, that's all you need to know. And they nodded, and that was apparently that. He showed her the kitchen first. She could see why. It was the most neglected room in the house, not dirty exactly, but unused in a way that went past just dishes or groceries. Unused in the way of a room that people had stopped feeling comfortable in. The stove was cold. The shelves were half empty. There was a pot hanging that hadn't been taken down in a while, and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture, and a big pine table that could seat 8 and probably hadn't seen 8 people sitting at it together in years. There's a larder through that door, Nathan said. I keep it stocked reasonably. Whatever you need that isn't there, make me a list. He paused at the kitchen doorway. My father's room is at the end of the hall. He may not open his door. That's just how he is. All right. Your room is up the stairs, first door on the left. Thank you. He nodded and left. Clara stood in the kitchen alone. She put her hand flat on the cold surface of the stove and was quiet for a moment, feeling the silence of the house around her. It wasn't the silence of peace or rest. It was the silence of absence. Of things that used to happen here that had stopped happening. Of warmth that had been let go, not because nobody wanted it, but because nobody knew anymore how to ask for it back. She went to the larder. There were beans dried, salt pork, some root vegetables going soft but still usable, a half sack of flour, Dried herbs tied in small bundles. Someone at some point had kept a kitchen garden and had cared enough to put things up for winter. She found a jar of preserved tomatoes and another of apple butter and a small crock of lard. In the back corner behind a sack of cornmeal, she found a dried beef shank with enough meat on it to make something real. She tied on the apron she found hanging on the inside of the larder door, and she got to work. She got the stove lit first. Then she got water from the pump and set it to heat. She cut the vegetables with a knife she found that was sharper than she expected, which told her something about Nathan Cole, a man who kept his tools in good order even when he'd let everything else go to cold. She browned the beef shank in the pot with a little lard. She put in the preserved tomatoes and the beans she'd set to soaking the moment she found them, and the herbs she recognized: thyme and a dried sage, and something that might have been rosemary, and she let it all go low and slow while she mixed up a quick bread in a cast iron pan. The smell changed the house. She felt it before she heard it. She was standing at the stove stirring the stew when she heard it, a sound from the far end of the hall. A door. An old door on heavy hinges creaking open. She didn't turn around. She kept stirring. Footsteps. Slow. The measured footsteps of a man who had learned to move carefully because moving carefully hurt less. They stopped at the kitchen doorway. "Who are you?" The voice was rough and low and had the texture of something that had been through a great deal and had stopped being smooth about it. Clara glanced over her shoulder. Samuel Cole was a tall man who had gone thin in the way some old men do, not fragile exactly, but pared down like a piece of wood someone had been whittling at for years. He had Nathan's same dark eyes and Nathan's same directness in the way he looked at her. But where Nathan's directness was careful, almost contained Samuel's, was the directness of a man who had stopped caring what anyone thought of him. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "Your son hired me today." Samuel Cole looked at the pot. He looked at her. He looked at the pot again. "That stew. It will be in about another hour." He was quiet. She could feel him working something out, some internal argument, some old man's debate with himself about whether to pursue this further or retreat back to the silence he'd apparently been living in. "My wife used to put sage in her stew," he said finally. "There's sage in this one." Another silence. "I'll sit," he said in the tone of a man announcing a decision he has not fully made peace with, and he pulled out one of the chairs at the big pine table and lowered himself into it. Clara kept cooking. Samuel sat. Neither of them said anything for a while, and somehow the silence between them was completely different from the silence she'd walked into. It was inhabited now. It had warmth in it. It was the silence of two people who were both in the same room on purpose, and had decided without discussing it that they were willing to stay. "You come far?" Samuel asked. "Ohio, originally." "Long way." "Yes, sir." "What brought you out here?" Clara considered the truthful answer and the partial answer, and the answer that would require the least explanation, and then she said, "Somebody made me a promise they didn't keep, so I had to make different plans." Samuel grunted. "Somebody always does." She heard the front door. Nathan's boots on the wood floor of the entry stopping. She heard the moment he registered the smell. She heard him pause. And then his footsteps came down the hall slower than they had been, going out the way a person walks when they're following something and aren't entirely sure what they're going to find at the end of it. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He saw his father at the table. He stood absolutely still for a moment, and Clara, who was facing the stove, couldn't see his face, but she heard the change in his breathing, the small, involuntary catch of it, the sound a person makes when they see something they had stopped expecting. Then he looked at Clara. "Who made the stew?" She turned around. "I did." Nathan Cole looked at her across the kitchen. His father was sitting at the table for the first time in she didn't know how long. The house smelled like food and warmth. The stove was lit, and the bread was browning in the pan, and something that had been cold and shut up for 3 years was right now in this moment open. He said, "You weren't supposed to be in my kitchen." She held his gaze. You told me I was in charge of the cooking. I meant starting tomorrow. The men were hungry today. A pause. My father hasn't sat at that table since Christmas. Well, Clara said, and turned back to the stove. It's not Christmas, but supper's almost ready. There was a silence behind her that she felt more than heard. And then Nathan Cole walked to the table and pulled out the chair across from his father and sat down. The three of them ate together that night. Nathan and Samuel and Clara at the big pine table in the kitchen, with the stove throwing out heat and the bread still warm from the pan. Nobody said a great deal. Nobody had to. Samuel asked for a second portion without being prompted, which Nathan watched with the expression of a man trying not to let himself feel too much about something he'd apparently been waiting a long time to see. Nathan ate with the focused efficiency of a man who worked hard and needed fuel. But twice Clara caught him pausing spoon partway to his mouth, simply listening to his father talk. Because Samuel was talking. Not about anything significant. About a horse he'd owned 40 years ago. About a winter in Wyoming that broke records. About a card game he'd won, and a card game he'd lost, and the difference between knowing when to fold and knowing when you didn't have any choice about it. But he was talking out loud to other people at a table over food, and Clara understood without anyone needing to explain it that this was not a small thing. After supper, she washed the dishes. Nathan came and dried them without being asked. You didn't have to do that tonight, he said, and she understood he didn't mean the dishes. I know. He was quiet for a moment. My father hasn't talked like that in... He stopped, cleared his throat. In a good while. He misses having someone to talk to. He misses my mother. Yes, Clara said. That too. Nathan put a dried bowl back in its place on the shelf. He did it carefully, the way he did everything, with a kind of quiet precision that spoke of a man who handled things with attention, because he'd learned that things broke if you weren't paying enough care. What did he take from you? Nathan said. Clara looked at him sideways. Avery, Nathan said. What did he take from you? He took... She stopped. She thought about the months of correspondence, the hope she'd built, letter by letter, the way she'd let herself believe, really believe, that this was the thing that was finally going to be different. He took something I'd spent a long time saving up, she said. I reckon I shouldn't have put it all in one place. That's not your fault. No, she said. It isn't. And she meant it, and she could hear in her own voice that she was still working on fully believing it. Nathan set the last dish away. You should know, he said, turning to face her, leaning one shoulder against the kitchen wall, that people in this town are going to talk. They're already talking. A woman arriving the way you did under those circumstances, people around here will have opinions. People have always had opinions about me, Clara said. I imagine so. Something in his voice was careful and not unkind. I just want you to know that what people say in town has no bearing on what goes on at this ranch. Your work here is your business, and it's between you and me, and it's nobody else's concern. Clara looked at him directly. Mr. Cole, I appreciate that. And I want to be equally clear with you, I am here to work. I'm not here because I've run out of options and need a man to solve my problems for me. I've been in situations worse than this one, and I have managed them on my own terms. If I'm still here in a week, it's because the arrangement is genuinely useful to both of us, not because I don't have anywhere else to go. A long pause. Nathan Cole looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between surprised and strangely relieved. Fair enough, he said. Good night, Mr. Cole. Good night, Miss Whitmore. She went upstairs to her room, the first door on the left, and she locked the door behind her. Not because she was afraid, but because having a door that locked was something she hadn't had in a long time, and she wanted to feel what it felt like. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark for a moment. She took Thomas Avery's letter out of her pocket. She didn't reread it. She folded it one more time, smaller than before, and set it on the windowsill and looked out at the Montana sky, which at night was absolutely astonishing, more stars than she had ever seen in Ohio, more dark and more light at the same time than seemed possible. She thought about Samuel Cole, sitting at the pine table, saying absolutely nothing important in the most important way. She thought about Nathan Cole, standing at the kitchen door, with that stillness watching his father speak. She thought about the way the house had smelled when she left it tonight, warm and used and alive, in a way it apparently hadn't been for some time. She had not fixed anything, she told herself. She had made one pot of stew. She was one woman in a strange house in a strange state with $3.25 to her name, and a heart that had been broken in a fairly new way on top of several much older ways. But she was here. She was still here. And for tonight, that was enough. She lay down without undressing. She was tired enough that it didn't matter, and she was asleep within minutes, deeper and more steadily than she had slept in months. Outside, the Montana wind moved across the grassland. In his room at the end of the hall, Samuel Cole did not lie awake the way he usually did. He closed his eyes and thought about a horse he'd owned 40 years ago and fell asleep before he'd finished the story. And Nathan Cole sat at the empty kitchen table for a long time after the house had gone quiet, with both hands flat on the pine surface, and a look on his face that nobody was there to see something that hadn't visited him in long enough that he almost didn't recognize it when it arrived. Something that felt with great uncertainty and great care, like the very first fragile edge of hope. Clara was up before the sun. That was not unusual. She had been waking before sunrise since she was 9 years old, when her mother used to say that the first hour of the morning belonged to the people who were willing to earn it. She didn't need an alarm. She didn't need anyone to tell her it was time. Her body simply knew the way bodies know things you've trained into them over years of necessity. And she was dressed and downstairs and had the stove lit before the first gray light started coming through the kitchen window. She found more in the larder than she'd had time to properly inventory the night before. A full sack of oats behind the cornmeal, 3 dozen eggs in a covered basket, a side of salt pork wrapped in cheesecloth, dried apples, a small wheel of hard cheese. She stood in the larder doorway and took stock of it with the focused attention of a woman who had learned early that knowing exactly what you had to work with was the difference between getting through a week and not. She made oats with dried apple and a scrape of the apple butter she'd found last night. She made coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright because in her experience, men who worked with their hands before breakfast needed their coffee to mean something. She fried up the salt pork in strips and kept them warm on the back of the stove. She was cutting the hard cheese into portions when she heard the first of the ranch hands come through the back door, and she turned around and said, "Sit down, it's ready." In the tone of a woman who was not asking, and the man, young maybe 20 with hay in his hair and a face that was still deciding what it was going to look like, sat down immediately without questioning it. 3 more came in behind him. Then a 5th older with a gray beard and a permanent squint from years of looking into prairie wind. They all sat, they all ate, and Clara stood at the stove and watched from the corner of her eye and noted who ate fast and who ate slow, and who looked up to say thank you and who didn't, and filed all of it away because knowing the people around you was the same kind of skill as knowing your larder essential and not something anyone was going to hand you. You had to do it yourself. The older one with the gray beard said, "Best breakfast I've had at this ranch since I don't know when," and said it quietly, like he didn't want to make a fuss about it, just wanted it on record. "Thank you," Clara said. "What's your name?" He looked mildly surprised that she'd asked. "Hector. Hector Dunn." "How long have you been at Cole Ranch, Hector?" 11 years this coming October, she nodded. "Then you knew Mrs. Cole." Something moved through the table, a quieting. The young one with the hay in his hair looked at his oats. "Yes, ma'am," Hector said. "We all did, those of us who've been here a while." She was... He stopped, seemed to choose the words with care. "She was a good woman." "She must have been," Clara said simply and turned back to the stove, and that was all she said about it, because she understood that some things you acknowledge and then let alone. Nathan came in last. He came in from outside, not from upstairs, which meant he'd already been out since before she was up, and she noted that too. He went to the sink and washed his hands, washed them properly, thoroughly, the way a man washes who actually wants to be clean, rather than just going through the motions, and dried them on the cloth she'd hung on the hook beside the sink. He looked at the table of men eating. He looked at the plate she'd set at the empty chair. He sat down. "You're up early?" he said. "So are you. I've got fence on the north pasture that won't wait." "Then eat while it's hot." He ate. He didn't say much, but then he hadn't struck her as a man who talked when he didn't have something specific to say, which she found more comfortable than the alternative. After the men had cleared out and it was just the two of them left in the kitchen, he poured himself a second cup of coffee and stood at the window looking out at the pasture in the way of a man who is looking at his land and running numbers at the same time. "My father sleep through?" he asked. "I haven't heard him yet. He usually doesn't come out until mid-morning, if he comes out at all." A pause. "I don't want you to take it personally if he... Mr. Cole." She was washing bowls at the sink and she didn't stop. "Your father sat at this table for 2 hours last night and told me about a horse named Devil Jack and a winter in Wyoming that froze the river solid and a poker hand he drew in Cheyenne that he still isn't sure he played right. I think we're past the point where I'd take his silences personally." Nathan was quiet behind her. "He told you about Devil Jack, at considerable length." Another pause longer. "He hasn't talked about that horse in 15 years. Clara kept washing. People talk about things when they feel like someone's actually listening. She heard Nathan set his coffee cup down. She heard him start to say something, and then stop himself. She heard him put his hat on and go back out the door. And after he was gone, she stood at the sink for a moment, with the dishwater cooling around her hands, and thought about all the ways silence could mean completely different things, depending on whose it was. Samuel came out at 9. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, in the same careful way he had the night before, and Clara looked up from the bread dough she was working and said, "Good morning." And he said, "Morning," and sat down at the table without being invited, which she took as a good sign. She poured him coffee without asking. He wrapped both hands around the mug the way old men do and looked at her across the kitchen with those dark eyes that were the same as his son's, but less guarded, or perhaps just guarded in a different direction. "You make the bread yourself," he said, watching her hands in the dough. "My mother taught me." What kind of woman was she? Clara looked up, mildly surprised by the directness of the question. "Practical," she said after a moment. "Warm, but not soft. The kind of woman who could tell you hard news and make you feel by the time she was done that you had what it took to handle it." Samuel considered this. "My wife was like that," he said. "Ruth. Her name was Ruth." He said the name with the weight of a man who has been carrying it alone for a long time and is grateful for the chance to set it down somewhere, even just for a moment. She used to say that the measure of a person wasn't what happened to them, but what they did with their hands while it was happening. Clara looked at her hands in the bread dough. "That's a good saying," she said. "She was a good woman." "She sounds like it." Samuel looked at his coffee. "Nathan doesn't talk about her. Won't. I understand why he handles things by not handling them, always has since he was a boy. But sometimes I think..." He stopped, shook his head once, the gesture of a man changing his mind about finishing a thought. "Never mind an old man." "I don't mind at all," Clara said. He looked at her directly then, with something sharp and appraising in it. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something smaller." He said it without meanness, simply as an observation, as if he were reporting a fact about the weather. "Women who come out here answering advertisements are usually one of two things, desperate or deluded. You don't seem like either." "I was desperate yesterday morning," Clara said evenly. "I reckon I'm something different today." The corner of Samuel's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the preliminary suggestion of one. "What are you today?" Clara pressed the heels of her hands into the dough and turned it. "Determined," she said. Samuel made a sound that might, in a less contained man, have been a laugh. He drank his coffee. He watched her work, and they fell into the comfortable rhythm of two people who have discovered, somewhat to their surprise, that they can occupy the same space without difficulty. It was Hector Dunn who told her toward the middle of that first week. He'd come in for his midday meal, and the other men were all at the table, and Clara was ladling out the bean soup she'd made with a ham hock she'd found buried in the back of the smokehouse, and Hector lingered after the others had gone back out. He stood at the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that had something apologetic about it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "there's something you ought to know about Avery." She set down the ladle. "All right." Hector turned his hat around once in his hands. "Thomas Avery is not a good man. I know that's not news to you given what he did, but what you might not know is that it wasn't the first time. There was a woman before you. Came out from Illinois 2 years ago. Same sort of situation, answered an advertisement, arrived here expecting one thing, got something else entirely." Clara was very still. "What happened to her?" "She ended up working at the boarding house for 6 months until she had enough saved to get back home." He paused. But the story that went around, the story Avery told it, wasn't kind. He said she'd misrepresented herself in her letters. He said she wasn't what he'd been led to believe. Hector looked at her steadily. People believed him because people in small towns tend to believe the man with the land and the money over the woman with the suitcase. Clara felt something cold move through her. Not surprise, something closer to recognition, the particular feeling of hearing a pattern described that you already knew in your bones, even if you'd never seen it laid out in words before. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because Avery is already talking," Hector said. "About you, in town. And the story he's telling is—" He turned his hat one more time. "It isn't generous, Miss Whitmore." "What's he saying?" Hector seemed to weigh it. "That you misled him about your family's financial situation. That there was supposed to be inheritance money that didn't exist. That you came out here under false pretenses." He held her gaze. "None of which is true. I know that. Mr. Cole will know that. But the town will hear what it hears," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." She picked the ladle back up. Her hand was perfectly steady. "Thank you, Hector. I appreciate you telling me." He nodded and put his hat back on and went out, and Clara stood at the stove and breathed and let the information settle into her like cold water. Let herself feel the full chill of it, because she had found over the years that the only thing worse than knowing a bad thing was pretending you didn't. Thomas Avery was lying about her. In a town where she was already the object of pity and low laughter, a man with land and money and 11 years of established reputation was building a story that cast her as a fraud. And she had been in Willow Creek for 5 days. She had nothing here, no reputation, no family, no history that could counter the story being told about her. She had a locked room and $3 and a ranch job and 2 people, a grieving old man and a man who barely spoke, who had shown her in their separate ways something that might eventually become trust, but was not yet anything she could take to town and use as evidence. She finished ladling the soup. She washed the pot. She started the bread for supper. She was not going to panic. She was not going to go into town and confront anyone or defend herself to people whose minds were already half made up. She was going to do what she had always done, which was keep her hands moving and her eyes open and trust that the truth had a way of making itself known to people who were willing to see it, even if that took longer than it should. Nathan came in at 4 in the afternoon with a cut on his left hand wrapped in a piece of his own shirt sleeve, and a look on his face that suggested he was not in the mood to discuss it. "What happened?" Clara said. "Fence wire." "Sit down." "It's fine." "Nathan Cole, sit down." He looked at her. Something crossed his face, that same expression she'd caught briefly once or twice. Something between startled and not entirely displeased. He sat down. She got the first aid box she'd found in the bottom cabinet and cleaned the cut with the carbolic she found in it, and he sat with his hand flat on the table, and his jaw set in the manner of a man who was enduring medical attention as a matter of principle rather than preference. "Hector told me about Avery," she said while she was wrapping his hand. Nathan's eyes came up to her face. "What's he saying in town?" she said. She kept her voice even clinical, the same voice she was using about his hand. "You know what he's saying?" "I know what Hector told me. I want to know what you know." Nathan was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hand in hers. "He's saying you wrote letters claiming your father left you land in Ohio, saying you misrepresented your situation to secure a proposal." "That's a lie." "I know it is." "You know it because Hector told you, or you know it because—" "I know it," Nathan said quietly, "because I have met exactly one Thomas Avery in my life, and I have met many women who have been lied to by men like him, and the two types are not hard to tell apart once you've got both in front of you." His voice was completely level. He wrote the advertisement. He initiated the correspondence. He made the promises. Whatever story he's telling now, it's a story he's building because he's embarrassed, and men like that build stories the same way they build everything else at other people's expense. Clara tied off the bandage. She sat back. She said, "I need you to know something, Mr. Cole. I am not asking you to fight my battles. I am not asking you to go into town and set people straight on my behalf. If that's what this conversation turns into, I'm going to need you to stop." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I've spent my life having people decide what my battles are and how to fight them without consulting me, and I've found it doesn't generally end with anyone doing me any real good, and it often ends with me owing someone something I didn't agree to owe." She met his eyes directly. "If there's going to be a reckoning with Thomas Avery, it'll happen when I decide it should, and on terms I understand. Not before." Nathan Cole looked at her for a long moment. "That's a fair position," he said. "I know it is." He looked like he was going to say something else, and then didn't. He took his bandaged hand off the table and stood up and went to the sink and poured himself a glass of water. And Clara watched him drink it and thought about the particular quality of a man who could hear a woman tell him to stay out of her business and respond with agreement instead of injury. It was rarer than it should have been. "Supper in an hour," she said. "I'll be here," he said, and went back out. She was beating the biscuit dough when Samuel came and sat at the table and watched her with those sharp eyes and said without preamble, "My son hasn't sat down at the supper table 3 nights running since Ruth died." Clara kept working the dough. "Tonight will be 4, Samuel said. She looked up. Samuel was looking at her with an expression that was doing several things at once, observing, calculating, remembering something, and arriving somewhere all at the same time. "I'm not going to make any pronouncements," he said. "I'm old, not foolish. But I want you to know that I see what's happening in this house." "What's happening in this house," Clara said carefully, "is that I'm cooking supper." Samuel's almost smile again. "Keep telling yourself that." She did not respond to that, but she felt the warmth of it move through her chest, in spite of herself. Unexpected, like the first day of actual spring after a winter that has gone on too long. That was the 3rd evening. On the 4th day, she went into town. She went because she needed flour, and she needed it from the general store, and she was not going to send one of the ranch hands to get it on her behalf, because that would be the behavior of a woman who was hiding, and she was not hiding. She put on her second dress, which was slightly better than the first, and she braided her hair the way her mother had taught her, neat, plain, no fuss, and she walked into Willow Creek with her chin level and her list in her hand. The whispers started before she reached the general store. She heard her name. She heard Thomas Avery's name. She heard a phrase that contained the word swindler, which was so far outside the territory of anything even remotely true that it had an almost clarifying effect. It was so wrong that it simplified the situation considerably. These people had decided. Nothing she did in the next 10 minutes was going to change the minds of people who had already decided. So she simply had to get her flour and go home. She was reaching for a sack on the shelf when she heard a voice behind her intentionally close, designed to be heard by both her and anyone else in the immediate vicinity. "Nervy of her coming in here." She did not turn around. Looking at her, you'd think butter wouldn't melt, but you know what they say, still waters. She took the flour sack down from the shelf and turned to carry it to the counter, and that was when she came face to face with Thomas Avery. He was not what she'd imagined. His letters had been careful and well constructed, and she had built from them unconsciously, the image of someone careful and well-constructed. The man in front of her was broad-shouldered and well-dressed, and had the easy confidence of someone who had never spent much time worrying about consequences, because consequences, in his experience, tended to happen to other people. He was handsome in a blunt, obvious way. He was looking at her with something that was almost amusement, as if her presence here were a minor entertainment. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She looked at him. She said nothing. "I hear you've landed on your feet," he said. "Cole Ranch. Good position." He said it in the tone of a man describing something small that has managed to exceed expectations. The store had gone very quiet. "Mr. Avery," Clara said. Her voice was completely steady. She was profoundly grateful for every experience in her life that had required her to be steady, because all of it had been practice for right now. "You lied to me in your letters." The amusement flickered. "I beg your pardon. You represented yourself as a man of honor seeking an honest partnership. You were neither." She kept her voice low and even, the way you'd discuss something practical. "You led me across 3 states on promises you never intended to keep, and now you're building a story in this town that inverts the facts of the situation. I'm not here to argue with you about it. I just want you to hear me say clearly that I know what you did and I know what you're doing, and I am not confused about the difference between the two." Thomas Avery's amusement was entirely gone. There was a half a beat of complete silence in the store. "You've got some nerve," he said, and his voice had an edge now. "Yes," Clara said. "I do." She picked up her flour sack and turned to the counter. "Good afternoon, Mr. Avery." She paid for her flour. She walked out of the general store. She walked down the main street of Willow Creek with her flour under her arm, and her heart hammering so loud she was certain anyone standing close enough could hear it, and she did not stop walking until she was out of sight of the main street. Then she stopped. She leaned against the wall of the livery stable and breathed. Her hands were shaking now, which she permitted because she had earned the shaking. She had held herself together inside that store through what felt like a feat of pure structural engineering, and now that she was outside and alone and could let the structure relax a little, her body was taking the opportunity to express its opinions about the experience. "Miss Whitmore." She straightened immediately. Nathan Cole was standing 10 feet away with a coil of rope over one shoulder, and an expression that told her he'd seen at least some of what had happened. "I told you," she said, before he could speak, "that I didn't need anyone to fight my battles. I'm not fighting anything. I'm buying rope." He looked at her for a moment. "You all right?" "My hands are shaking." "I can see that." "It'll pass." "I know." He didn't try to come closer. He just stood there at his 10 feet of distance with the rope on his shoulder, and she had the sudden, precise understanding of what he was doing. He was simply being present without crowding her, being available without imposing, which was a kind of attention she was not entirely accustomed to. "He's lying," she said, "about the money, about the letters." "I know he is. How does this end?" She asked it not because she expected him to have the answer, but because she needed to say it out loud to someone, needed to hear herself ask the question, because that was the only way to stop it from circling endlessly in the silence of her own head. Nathan was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was actually thinking about it, rather than reaching for something comfortable to say. "Men like Avery," he said, "they build their stories on the assumption that other people's silence is the same as agreement. The longer you stay quiet, the more their version becomes the one people know." He shifted the rope. "But you were just in that store. You weren't quiet." "No." "So." She looked at him. "So." They were quiet together for a moment, which was starting to feel like something they were becoming capable of without it being strange. "The flour's heavy," he said. "I can take it." "I've got it." "All right." He walked with her to where the wagon was hitched. He didn't offer to help her up onto the seat. He simply positioned himself on the other side of the horses, checking the traces, which meant he was busy and she was independent, and they were both going to the same place. and there was nothing more to be said about any of it. She appreciated that more than she would have known how to say. On the ride back with the mountains going purple in the late afternoon light, Samuel's voice was in her head, saying what her mother would have said in the same situation. The measure of a person wasn't what happened to them. It was what they did with their hands while it was happening. She looked at her hands on the flour sack in her lap. They had stopped shaking. That night at supper, Nathan told Samuel what had happened in town. Not all of it, just the shape of it, the fact of it, that Avery was building a story and that Clara had faced him down in the general store. Samuel listened without interrupting. When Nathan finished, Samuel looked at Clara. "What did you say to him?" Samuel asked. Clara told him. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his fork and said with great and deliberate calm, "Good." Nathan said nothing. But under the table, without drawing any attention to it, he reached for the bread basket and put a piece on her plate because she'd been serving everyone else, and her own plate was still half empty, and he'd noticed, and he was choosing to do something about it without making any remark about it at all. Clara looked at the bread on her plate. She looked up. Nathan was already talking to his father about the north pasture fence. He was not looking at her. She ate the bread. And she thought very quietly in the part of herself she was still keeping careful watch over the part that had been wrong about things before, and needed to be cautious about being wrong again. She thought that she was going to have to be very, very careful here. Because Willow Creek had a man in it who was building lies about her and a town full of people who were inclined to believe him. But this ranch had something else entirely, and she was not yet sure what to do with that. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Clara knew it was going to be trouble before she even opened it, because it came addressed to Nathan Cole in care of Cole Ranch, and the return address was a law office in Billings. And in her experience, law offices in Billings did not write to ranchers in Willow Creek to share good news. She set it on the kitchen table beside Nathan's coffee cup and said nothing, and when he came in from the morning's work and saw it sitting there the way his jaw shifted, told her she'd read the situation correctly. He opened it, standing up, which was how she'd noticed men always opened letters. They expected to be bad, as if remaining on their feet gave them some structural advantage over whatever was inside. He read it twice. He set it down. "Avery's claiming water rights," he said. "The creek that runs through my north pasture. He's filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office saying the diversion I built 3 years ago damaged his downstream access." Clara looked at the letter from across the kitchen. "Did it?" "No." His voice was flat and certain. "The diversion was built 6 feet inside my own property line. I had it surveyed. I have the paperwork." "Then you have a defense." "I have a defense that requires me to hire a lawyer in Billings and ride up there for a hearing and leave this ranch for the better part of a week." He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. "Which Avery knows perfectly well." She looked at him. "This is about me." Nathan's eyes came up. "He saw you with me on that road," she said. "He saw you bring me back to this ranch. And then I walked into his store and said what I said to his face in front of half the town." She kept her voice steady, because this was a thing she needed to think about clearly, not emotionally. "He's not coming after your water rights, Nathan. He's coming after you for taking my side." The kitchen was very quiet. Nathan set both hands flat on the table. He looked at the letter. He looked at his hands. He said quietly, "I know. I'm sorry. Don't." "Nathan." "Clara." He said her name the way he said everything with full weight, nothing wasted. "Don't apologize for existing. Don't apologize for what he's doing. You didn't do this." He picked up the letter and folded it. He did. She turned back to the stove because she needed a moment, and the stove gave her one. She poked at the coals with the iron unnecessarily, just to have something to do with her hands. "What will you do?" she said. "Write to my lawyer tonight. Ride to Billings next week." A pause. "In the meantime, nothing changes. The work doesn't stop because Thomas Avery has too much time and too much spite." Hector appeared in the kitchen doorway, and from the look on his face, he'd heard at least the last part of it. "Boss," he said, "you ought to know something." In town yesterday at the saloon, Avery was talking to Bill Crane. The name landed differently than the others. Nathan straightened. Crane, he said. Yes, sir. What were they talking about? Hector turned his hat in his hands, which she was beginning to recognize as his version of bracing himself. Couldn't hear all of it. But I heard your name, and I heard the words land office, and I heard Avery say something about the deed to the South Quarter. Nathan was very still. Clara looked between the two men. The South Quarter, she said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. There's a portion of land on the southern edge of my property. My father bought it when he first came to Montana before I was born. The original deed was written in... He paused. In 61. The records are old. There was a fire at the county clerk's office in 78 that destroyed a portion of the land records for this area. And Crane, Bill Crane, is the current county land registrar, Nathan said. He and Avery have done business together before. Nothing I was ever able to prove, but... He stopped. Hector said quietly, They're not just coming for the water rights, Mr. Cole. The kitchen was silent enough that Clara could hear the fire inside the stove. No, Nathan said. They're not. He was gone before she could say another word out the back door with Hector behind him, and Clara stood at the stove with the realization settling into her like a stone, into deep water, slow at first, and then with the full weight of it hitting the bottom. Thomas Avery wasn't embarrassed. He was organized. The water rights claim was a distraction, or perhaps the first move in something that had been planned longer than she'd understood. A man who operated this way, who moved from jilted fiancé to fake legal claims to land office collusion inside of 2 weeks, was not a man who was reacting. He was a man who had done this kind of thing before and knew exactly how the pieces moved. And Nathan Cole's ranch was in his way. She was still working through this when Samuel came into the kitchen, moving faster than she'd seen him move before, which meant he'd heard. The South Quarter, he said without any preamble. Yes, that's my land. His voice was different. Not the slow, careful voice of an old man managing his grief. This was the voice of someone who had been roused from something and was not pleased about it. I bought that land in 1861 with money I earned working cattle drives in Texas for 3 years. I have the original bill of sale. I have correspondence with the previous owner. I have... He stopped. His hands were shaking, and not the shaking of age. Where is Nathan? He just went out. I need to talk to him. Samuel. She caught his eye. Sit down. Clara, that land is... I know. Sit down. She said it firmly, gently, the way you'd speak to someone you respected, who was about to make a decision from panic instead of reason. Sit down and think for a minute, because running out to Nathan right now when he's already angry isn't going to help anyone. Samuel looked at her. He sat down. She poured him coffee. She sat across from him. She folded her hands on the table and said, Tell me everything you remember about the deed. He told her. It took 40 minutes. She asked questions, and he answered them, and she listened with the focused filing attention she'd developed over years of managing households where the details that seemed small were always the ones that mattered. The original seller's name, the date, the price paid, the witnesses to the transaction, the lawyer in Bozeman who had drawn up the papers in 61 and whose firm Samuel believed still existed. When he finished, she said, Do you have any of this in writing letters, receipts? Anything? I have everything, Samuel said. In a tin box in my room. I have kept it since the day I bought that land, because Ruth told me to, and Ruth was never wrong about what to keep. Clara looked at him. Can you get it? He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. She found Nathan at the barn and told him what Samuel had said, and she watched the tension in his shoulders change, not disappear but shift from the sharp, rigid kind to the kind that has somewhere to go. He kept everything, Nathan said. Everything. Your mother told him to. Nathan pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his forehead, a gesture of a man absorbing relief that he wasn't quite willing to show fully. Of course she did. Your lawyer in Billings needs to see that tin box. Yes? And whoever you trust in this town, Hector, anyone else, they need to know what Avery and Crane are doing, because if it's happened before and people know it's a pattern that's different from one rancher's word against a land registrar. Nathan looked at her. You've been thinking about this. I've been standing in my kitchen thinking about it for the last hour, yes. Something moved across his face, that she was starting to be able to read, a kind of arrested attention, the expression of a man who is being surprised by someone in a way he doesn't have a category for yet. Clara, he said, I need to ask you something. She waited. What Avery told people about money, about inheritance, is there anything there that could be used? Any piece of paper, any letter you wrote him that could be misread? She looked at him steadily. I wrote him 6 letters over 4 months. I told him I was a cook and a housekeeper. I told him my parents were deceased. I told him I owned nothing except what I could carry, and that what I could bring to a marriage was my labor and my character and my word. She held his gaze. Every one of those letters is the truth. Do you have copies? I kept every draft. Where? In my room, in my Bible. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You kept the drafts. My mother kept copies of every letter she ever wrote. She said that a woman who didn't keep records of her own words had given up her only defense. Clara paused. I'm starting to think your mother and my mother would have gotten along. Nathan almost smiled. Not quite, but almost, and it was enough. That evening, the mood at supper was different. Hector came to the table with news from one of the other hands who'd been in town. 2 men, small ranchers east of Willow Creek, had apparently had similar trouble with Avery and Crane 2 years earlier. Lost a grazing easement through a procedural challenge at the land office that nobody had been able to fully explain. One of them had moved his family to Wyoming afterward. Samuel sat at the table and listened to this with his jaw set and his eyes clear and sharp, and when Hector finished, he said, They've been doing this for 2 years and nobody's connected it. Nobody who had the same lawyer and the same records and the same time to fight it, Nathan said. We have all 3, Samuel said. The table was quiet. We have all 3, Nathan agreed. Clara listened and did not say anything, but she felt something shifting in the room. The particular shift of people who have been absorbing bad news and are in the process of deciding to stop absorbing and start moving. She cleared the supper dishes. She was at the sink when Nathan came to stand beside her, drying again without being asked. They worked in silence for a while, and she was thinking about Avery and the tin box and the lawyer in Billings and the shape of the thing they were up against, and she almost missed it when Nathan said quietly, Why did you stay? She looked at him sideways. After the general store, he said. After Hector told you what Avery was saying in town. You could have taken coach fare and left, and nobody would have blamed you. He dried a bowl, set it on the shelf with that same precise care. Why did you stay? Clara thought about it for a moment. Because leaving would have meant he was right, she said. Not about the money that's just a lie, and lies don't require running from. But about the rest of it. She handed him the next bowl. He sent me away because he decided I wasn't worth what I cost. Every person who's ever done that to me, every relative who sent me somewhere else, every employer who let me go when something more convenient came along, they all decided the same thing, that I was a problem to be managed until I could be redirected. She was quiet for a moment. I'm tired of being redirected. Nathan was quiet too. This is a good place, she said, and meant it simply. Your father is a good man who has forgotten how to live with people, and he's remembering. Your men are decent. The work is real. She looked out the dark window above the sink. I haven't been in a place this honest in a long time. Nathan set the last bowl on the shelf. He turned to face her, leaning one shoulder against the cabinet the way he sometimes did, and she felt the full weight of his attention, the way she always did, like something tangible in the air between them. There's something I haven't told you, he said. She went still. When I saw you on that platform before I knew anything about Avery or the letter or any of it, I saw a woman who was being watched by half the town and was standing like she didn't require anything from any of them. He paused. I know what it costs to stand that way. My wife... He stopped. First time she'd heard him start that sentence. Eleanor stood that way. She was sick for 8 months before she died, and she stood that way the entire time. Like she was going to be dignified about all of it if it killed her, which it did. Something in his voice was careful and unguarded at the same time. I know what that kind of backbone is worth, and I know what it costs. Clara was very quiet. I brought you here because I needed the work done, he said. I want you to know that's still true. I'm not saying anything that changes the arrangement. He was choosing his words with great precision, like a man who understood that certain words could not be unsaid, and was making sure he only said the right ones. But I want you to know I see you, not as a problem that needed solving, not as a charity case that wandered in. He met her eyes. I see you, Clara. The kitchen was absolutely still. She had been told she was pretty once or twice in her life by people who meant it kindly and not always honestly. She had been told she was useful more times than she could count, which was its own complicated thing. She had been told she was a good worker and a decent cook and a steady hand in difficult situations. Nobody had ever said I see you in that precise way before. She didn't say anything right away because she was not going to reach for the first response that came up, which was too much, too raw, too honest for a kitchen on a Thursday night with her hands still damp from the dishwater. She said, "Thank you, Nathan." He nodded. He pushed off from the cabinet and went to bank the stove for the night, and she dried her hands and folded the cloth over the sink, and the moment passed and became the thing it was going to be, not forgotten, not acted upon, but placed carefully somewhere it would keep. The next morning brought something worse. Hector came in at 7, with a look on his face that Clara had not seen on him before, and she had learned Hector's face well enough by now to know that the specific arrangement of his features at this moment meant something had happened that he did not know how to begin. "Mr. Cole," he said from the kitchen doorway. Nathan looked up from his coffee. "There was a rider last night. Came up from the South Road after dark." Hector turned his hat. "He left something on the fence post at the south property line." Nathan was already standing. "A notice," Hector said. "From the county land office. Official seal Crane's signature." He paused. "It says the Cole Ranch South Quarter is under review for title irregularity, pending investigation, and that no improvements, transfers, or alterations to the property are permitted during the review period, which they've set at 60 days. 60 days. Clara watched Nathan's face. He did not get angry. That was the thing about Nathan Cole. She had never once seen him get the loud, visible kind of angry that men who haven't learned anything from their lives got. What happened to Nathan's face when he was angry was that it became very quiet. His eyes went still and focused, and something behind them went cold in a way that was far more serious than shouting. "Crane can't do that," Nathan said. "A title review requires a legitimate complaint from an adjacent property holder." "Avery filed it," Hector said. "Yesterday afternoon, according to the notice. Filed it at the land office and Crane processed it same day." "Same day," Samuel said from the doorway of the kitchen. He'd heard. Of course he had. "Usually takes 2 weeks for processing." "I know, because I filed a boundary clarification in 74, and it took 20 days. His voice was absolutely measured. "Crane bypassed the standard review period." "Which means it was arranged in advance," Clara said. All 3 men looked at her. She looked at Nathan. "The water rights letter came 2 days ago. This notice was filed yesterday and served last night. That's not reaction time. That's a sequence that was already in motion." She kept her voice level. "Someone planned this order. The water rights claim first to put you on the defensive and cost you time and money. Then the title review to freeze the land so you can't sell it, can't improve it, can't use it as collateral if you need legal funds." She paused. "They're trying to cut off your options before you can organize a defense." The kitchen was very, very quiet. Samuel said almost to himself, "The lawyer in Bozeman." Nathan looked at him. "The man who drew up the original sale in 61, Wilson, Charles Wilson." Samuel's voice was picking up speed. His son James took over the practice. I wrote to him in '79 about the deed and he wrote back. I have that letter too in the tin box. He was already moving toward the hallway. James Wilson will have the original transaction records. Lawyers keep records. Good lawyers keep them forever. Nathan said, "Paul, I'm getting the box," Samuel said, and was gone down the hall, moving faster than he had in months. Nathan looked at Clara. "If Wilson has the original records," she said carefully, "and your survey documentation is intact, and those two ranchers east of town had similar trouble." "It's a pattern," Nathan said. "It's evidence," Clara said. "If someone knows how to use it." Nathan picked up his hat from the table. "I'm writing to Billings today, not next week. Today." He looked at her. "Will you be all right here?" "I'll be all right everywhere," she said. He almost smiled again. There it was, that almost. "Hector stays," he said. "And the other men don't leave the property until I'm back. Nobody talks to anyone who comes from town with official-looking papers without coming to you first. To me, you're the one who figured out the sequence," he said simply. "I trust your judgment." She took a breath. Nobody had said that to her either. Not in those words, not with that directness. "All right," she said. He was saddled and gone within the hour. Samuel stood on the porch and watched him ride out, and Clara stood beside him, and they watched until the dust of Nathan's horse disappeared into the distance. Then Samuel said, "You know this is about you." "I know." "He knows it too. I know that as well." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Nathan hasn't fought for anything since Eleanor died. Sold off the east pasture because it wasn't worth the effort. Stopped going to the cattlemen's meetings. Stopped—" He paused. "He stopped a lot of things." Clara said nothing because nothing seemed like the right response. "He's fighting for this," Samuel said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the road where his son had just disappeared. "I want you to know I see what's happening, and I want you to know that as far as this family is concerned—" He stopped, seemed to think. "As far as I'm concerned, there is no temporary about you." Clara felt it move through her, that warmth again, deeper this time. The kind of warmth that came from a place she'd kept covered for so long she'd almost forgotten it could be reached. "Samuel," she said. "Don't say thank you," he said firmly. "I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate." He turned back toward the door. "Now I'm going to get that tin box and write out everything I remember about the Wilson transaction in case my memory is better than the records." He went inside. Clara stood on the porch alone. Somewhere across those miles, Nathan Cole was riding toward Billings with his jaw set and his back straight and apparently something worth fighting for. And here on this porch in the thin morning light, Clara Whitmore stood with both feet on Cole Ranch land and thought very carefully, very quietly about how it had felt to hear "I see you and I trust your judgment. And there is no temporary about you all in the span of 18 hours. She thought about Thomas Avery and his letter and his law office collusion and his water rights claim and his 60-day title freeze. And she thought about all the things he thought he was taking. Then she thought about the tin box, the letters she kept in her Bible, the lawyer in Bozeman with records going back to 1861. Two ranchers east of town who'd been through something similar and probably thought nobody cared. And she thought quietly precisely the way she thought about everything that Thomas Avery had made a very significant miscalculation. He'd assumed the way men like him always assumed that the people he was taking from were alone. He was about to find out they weren't. She turned back inside. She had bread to make, and a household to run, and a plan beginning to form in the back of her mind that was going to need a letter to James Wilson in Bozeman, and a conversation with Hector about those two ranchers east of town. She tied on her apron. She got to work. Nathan was gone 4 days. Clara knew because she counted them, not in any way she would have admitted out loud, but in the particular way a person counts the days when someone's absence changes the texture of a place. The ranch ran fine. The men did their work. Samuel came to the kitchen every morning and sat at the table and talked, and she cooked and listened and asked questions, and in the evenings after supper, she sat at the kitchen table with paper and ink and wrote a letter to James Wilson in Bozeman that she drafted 3 times before she was satisfied with it. The first draft was too emotional. The second was too formal. The third was what her mother would have called workmanlike, clear, factual, specific, and polite in the way that made it very difficult to dismiss. She told Wilson what she knew about the original 1861 transaction using the details Samuel had given her. She told him about the fire at the county clerk's office in 1878 and the loss of the records. She told him about the title review notice Crane's signature the same day processing. She asked whether his firm retained original transaction documents from that period, and whether those records could be made available to Nathan Cole's attorney in Billings on an expedited basis. She signed it Clara Whitmore on behalf of the Cole household because she was not going to pretend she was anyone she wasn't, and she was not going to hide behind Nathan's name when she was the one holding the pen. She gave it to the youngest ranch hand, a boy named Pete, who was 17 and fast on a horse, and told him to write it to Bozeman personally and wait for a reply. Pete looked at her with the expression of someone receiving an assignment they find simultaneously alarming and important. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and was gone within the hour. She did not tell Samuel what she'd done until Pete was well down the road. Samuel listened, and then he said, "You signed your own name." "I did." "Avery will find out." "Avery already knows I'm here," Clara said. "I stopped worrying about what Avery finds out when he filed a notice at the county land office. At that point, I reckon he'd declared his intentions clearly enough." Samuel looked at her across the table. He had the tin box in front of him open because he'd been going through it all morning with the careful attention of a man cataloging ammunition. "When Nathan gets back," Samuel said, "I want to tell him what you did." "You can tell him whatever you like." "I want to tell him because I want him to understand the full picture." He looked at her steadily. "Clara, my son is a man who has spent 3 years making himself smaller than he is, selling off pieces of this ranch, stopping things he used to care about. Eleanor's death." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was different. Quieter, the voice of a man telling a truth he has turned over many times alone. Eleanor's death didn't just take his wife. It took the version of him that believed good things were allowed to last. And I have watched him go quiet in a way that scared me more than I ever said. Clara was very still. "You have been here 2 weeks," Samuel said. "And my son rode to Billings at a full gallop to fight for something. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She understood exactly what he was telling her. She said, "Samuel, I don't want to be the reason someone does things. I want to be with someone who does things because that's who they are." Samuel looked at her. "You think those are different?" he said. She didn't answer because she wasn't sure, and she wasn't going to pretend certainty she didn't have. Samuel reached into the tin box and pulled out a folded piece of paper, old and handled and yellowed at the creases. He held it out to her. She took it. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter. A woman's handwriting, looping and clear, dated November 1872. "Samuel," it began. "You are about to do something that frightens you. I know because when you are frightened, you get very quiet and you stop eating and you stare at things that aren't there. I need you to hear me say this. You are capable of everything. You're afraid you are not capable of. The land will be hard, and the winters will be brutal, and there will be years when you wonder why we came here at all. But you will not be doing it alone. And that changes everything. All of it. Every hard winter. Every bad year. It changes what it means, and it changes what you can bear. Come home soon. Your Ruth." Clara refolded the letter along its creases. She set it on the table. She didn't say anything for a long moment. "She wrote it when I went to file the original land claim," Samuel said. 63. I found it in my coat pocket 2 days after I left. Read it every day for a month." He took the letter back and returned it to the tin box with the same care he'd given everything in it. Ruth believed in the power of being not alone. Said it was the only real advantage a person could have. Clara swallowed. "I'll be in the garden," she said, which was not what she'd meant to say at all, but it was the only thing she could manage without the tears she was absolutely not going to shed at Samuel Cole's kitchen table, and she got up and went outside before he could say anything else. She stood in the kitchen garden she'd been slowly bringing back from neglect. The one that told her from its original planting that someone before her had cared about this place in the same specific rooted way. And she breathed the morning air and let the tears happen quietly, because they were going to happen regardless. And a garden was as decent a place as any. She was not crying about the letter exactly. She was crying about the word alone, about how many years she had been it, and how thoroughly she had convinced herself that being alone was a condition she had simply been born into, like eye color, or a tendency toward headaches. Something fixed. Something she had learned to manage, rather than something she might someday not have to manage anymore. The garden didn't have opinions about any of this, which was precisely why she was in it. She wiped her face. She checked on the tomatoes she'd transplanted last week. She pulled 3 weeds. By the time she went back inside, she was herself again, or the version of herself she showed to the world, which had always been a reasonably accurate representation anyway. Nathan rode in on the 4th evening at supper time, and Clara knew it was him before she heard his horse, because Hector, who had been watching the South Road all day with the patience of a man who had decided that was his job, now appeared in the kitchen doorway and said simply, "He's coming." She had supper on the table when Nathan walked through the door. He looked tired. The 4-day ride had the specific kind of tired in it that went past the body into something else. The tired of a man who has spent days in difficult conversations and hard negotiations, and is carrying the results of all of it across his shoulders in a way that doesn't unload the minute he sits down. He sat down. He looked at the table and at his father and at Clara, and he said, "My lawyer's name is Daniel Marsh. He has the survey documentation. He's seen the water rights claim and the title review notice." A pause. "He says Crane's same-day processing is irregular. He says he's seen this kind of procedural irregularity before, and it's not random." Another pause. "And he says if I can get him the original Wilson documentation, he believes we have enough to bring a formal challenge, not just to the water rights claim, but to the title review itself." Samuel set his coffee cup down very deliberately. "I've already written to Wilson," Clara said. Nathan looked at her. 4 days ago, I sent Pete to Bozeman with a letter. He left this morning." She held Nathan's gaze. "I should have told you I was going to do it. I'm telling you now." There was a beat of silence. "What did the letter say?" "Everything Samuel gave me about the 1861 transaction. Everything I understood about the fire and the missing records. A specific request for the original documents to be made available to your attorney in Billings on an expedited basis." She paused. "I signed my own name." The silence stretched a moment longer. "Clara," Nathan said, "if you're going to tell me I overstepped, I'm going to tell you," he said quietly, "that you are the most capable person I have ever had on this ranch, and I rode 400 miles without knowing you'd already done the most important thing that needed doing." Samuel said, "I tried to tell you." "You could have let me know before I left," Nathan said to his father. "I didn't know before you left. She wrote the letter after you rode out." Samuel picked up his fork. "Supper's getting cold." Nathan looked at Clara for one more moment. Something in his face had shifted some weight that had been there since the morning the law office letter arrived. Not gone, but redistributed, somehow shared, which was different. He picked up his fork. They ate. Afterward, when the men had gone and Samuel had gone to his room and the kitchen was quiet, and they were washing dishes again in the particular silence that had become theirs, Nathan said, "Avery knows you wrote the letter." Clara didn't stop washing. "I expected that. Crane has someone at the Bozeman post office. I found out while I was in Billings. They've been intercepting correspondence related to land disputes." He said it carefully. "Which means they know you're involved. They know you're not just the cook. I was never just the cook. I know." He dried a plate. "They're going to come after you directly." Whatever story Avery's been building in town, it's going to get worse. He's going to make it personal, Clara. More personal than it already is. What specifically? Nathan set the plate down. He's talking to the women in town, the ones who set the social temperature. He turned to face her, leaning against the counter. He's saying you came here under false pretenses, not just with him, but with me. He's saying you manipulated me into giving you shelter so you could work yourself into a position of influence on the ranch. Clara went still. He's saying... Nathan continued with the careful flatness of someone delivering news they find genuinely unpleasant to relay, that a woman like you knew she had no prospects and deliberately went after a grieving widower because she saw an opportunity. The dishwater was very quiet. A woman like you, Clara repeated. Those are his words. She breathed once steadily through the particular kind of anger that is so pure and complete, it almost becomes calm. He means my size. Yes. He means that a woman who looks like me ought to have been grateful for whatever he offered, and instead, I had the arrogance to walk away with my dignity and find myself somewhere I was actually treated like a person. And that's what makes him angrier than anything. Not the money, not the land, not any of it. The dignity. She turned back to the sink. Her hands were steady. He can't stand that I have any. Nathan said very quietly, he's wrong about all of it. I know he is. Clara. Something in his voice changed. Look at me. She looked at him. What he said about you, about your size, about your prospects. His voice was not loud or heated. It was very direct and very deliberate, the voice of a man choosing to be precise about something important. I need you to hear this from me clearly, because I reckon you've heard too many things from too many people who were wrong about you, and I don't want to be another person who let the important things go unsaid. He held her gaze. You are... He stopped. Started again. The first morning you were here, you cooked breakfast for 6 men and learned all their names and made my father talk about a horse he loved 40 years ago. You walked into that general store when you had every reason not to, and you stood in front of Avery and said what needed to be said. You wrote a letter to Bozeman using information you'd gathered in 4 days and signed your own name to it because you don't hide. He paused. You are the least like what Avery is saying about you of any person I have ever encountered. And I want you to know that I am aware of exactly who is standing in my kitchen, and it has nothing to do with what Avery thinks about your size or your prospects or anything else about you. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She said, Nathan. Yes. Thank you. A pause. And I need you to know what you just said. I believe you mean it. I also know that I have believed things before that turned out to be something different from what I thought they were, so I'm holding it carefully. She held his gaze. Not because I doubt you, but because I'm learning to be careful with good things instead of just waiting for them to be taken away. Nathan nodded, slowly. That's... He seemed to be looking for the word. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years. I'm trying to be someone who says honest things. You're succeeding. They stood for a moment in the kitchen, the dishwater gone cold, the stove banked low, the Montana night outside, doing what it always did, filling everything up with that astonishing dark and that astonishing light. Then Clara said, We need to talk about Crane. Nathan blinked. The shift was almost audible. Crane, he said. If he's intercepting correspondence, he knows James Wilson has been contacted, which means he knows Wilson's records are potentially in play. She moved to the table and sat down, and Nathan after a moment sat across from her. He's going to try to move before Pete gets back. He'll either push to accelerate the title review timeline, or he'll file something additional to complicate the legal picture, or... She stopped. Or he'll find another pressure point. Nathan was quiet, thinking. What other pressure point? Clara looked at him. You have debts. Every rancher has debts. Anything currently held by a bank or a private lender that could be called in with the right application of pressure. Nathan went very still. There's a note, he said slowly. On the eastern section, rebuild. I borrowed to replace the barn after it burned in '83. Local lender. A man named Garfield. Is Garfield connected to Avery? Not that I know of. Is Garfield connected to anyone who's connected to Avery? The look on Nathan's face answered the question before he did. His brother-in-law, Nathan said, works at the land office. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Nathan, Clara said, you need to write to Marsh tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight. Tell him about Garfield, the note, the amount, the terms, everything. She was already on her feet. I'll get the paper. Nathan caught her wrist as she passed him, not holding her, just stopping her for a moment. She turned. Why are you doing this? He said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a real question asked by a man who genuinely wanted to understand. She looked at him. Because I'm tired of watching men like Avery take things from people who worked for them, she said. Because your father read me a letter from your mother that said being not alone changes everything. And I think she was right. And I think I have spent 27 years not having that. And I would like to try being the person who helps change something instead of just the person who survives it. She held his gaze. And because this ranch is the first place I have been in a very long time, where I am treated like I am worth something, and I am disinclined to let Thomas Avery take it. Nathan let go of her wrist, very slowly. Get the paper, he said. She got the paper. They sat at the kitchen table until past midnight, Nathan writing to Marsh with Clara beside him, asking questions, remembering details, organizing the sequence of events into something that read not as a rancher's grievance, but as a documented pattern of fraudulent interference. 3 names, 3 cases, a timeline, a list of the overlapping connections between Avery Crane and Garfield. When Nathan sealed the letter and set down his pen, he rubbed both hands over his face and looked at what they'd produced. This is good, he said. It's a start, Clara said. It's more than I had 4 days ago. He looked at her across the table. More than I had 2 weeks ago. She was going to say something practical about getting to sleep before the morning chores, but Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway in his robe and his boots, and the look of a man who had not been able to sleep and was not apologetic about it. Did you write to Marsh? Samuel said. Just finished, Nathan said. About Garfield. Nathan looked at his father. How do you know about Garfield? I'm old, not deaf. I heard you talking 2 hours ago. Samuel came to the table and sat down. He looked at the sealed letter. Then he looked at Clara. What do we do about Crane? Clara said. Crane is the hinge. Avery has money and spite and local relationships, but he needs someone inside the land office to make any of this legally viable. Without Crane processing the claims, the whole scheme falls apart. So we go after Crane directly, Samuel said. We document what he's done in a way that makes it impossible for the territorial authorities to ignore, Clara said. The same-day processing, the intercepted correspondence if Marsh can subpoena that, the pattern of similar irregularities in other cases. She paused. But that takes time, and in the meantime, a sound outside. All 3 of them heard it. Nathan was on his feet before Clara had finished the thought. He moved to the window and then to the back door, and then he said quietly, Hector. Hector appeared from the bunkhouse direction, which meant he'd been awake too, which meant he'd heard something before any of them. Ryder, Hector said. South Road, stopped at the fence line. Just stopped? Put something on the post, rode back. Nathan went out. Clara followed him without asking permission, and Samuel came behind her with his coat thrown over his robe, because apparently no one in this household was going to let anyone else do the concerning things alone. Hector brought the lantern. They went to the south fence line in the dark. There was a document on the post. Nathan took it down and held it in the lantern light, and Clara stood close enough to read it over his arm. It was a notice from the county land office. The title review period had been accelerated. Instead of 60 days, Crane had issued an amended notice citing new evidence of irregularity, reducing the review window to 10 days. The hearing was scheduled for a week from Thursday. In Willow Creek. before a panel that included as appointed adjudicator one Thomas Avery. Clara read that last line twice. Thomas Avery, as an adjacent property holder with standing interest, had been appointed to sit on the panel adjudicating the title review of the property he had himself challenged. "He's the judge," Samuel said very quietly. "He's made himself the judge of his own case." Nathan folded the notice. He folded it the way he folded the first law office letter, standing up very deliberately, because he wasn't going to let whatever he was feeling right now make the decision for him. He turned back toward the house. "I need to send 2 more letters tonight," he said. "One to Marsh, one to the territorial governor's land office in Helena." His voice was very flat and very calm. "And tomorrow morning, I'm going to visit those 2 ranchers east of town who had trouble with Avery 2 years ago, because we are not going to walk into a room where the man who filed the complaint is also the man deciding the outcome." He looked at Hector. "Get Pete back from Bozeman. I need him to ride to Helena." "Tonight, first light." Hector nodded and went. Nathan looked at Clara and his father standing together in the lamplight. 10 days, he said. 10 days is enough, Clara said. She said it with a certainty she was not entirely sure she had, but she said it anyway because Samuel's wife had been right about something. There were moments when the most important thing you could do for someone was make sure they didn't face the night alone, and this was one of those moments. Nathan looked at her. Something in his face was open in a way she had not seen from him before. Not the careful openness of a man allowing himself one measured moment of honesty, but something rawer than that, something that had been there longer and had simply finally run out of room to hide. He said Clara, just her name, just that. And she knew with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life learning to read the things people couldn't bring themselves to say exactly what he meant by it. "I know," she said quietly. They stood there in the dark Montana night with 10 days to change everything, and Samuel Cole between them holding the lantern. And for the first time since she'd stepped off a stagecoach with a broken promise in her pocket and a suitcase that held everything she owned, Clara Whitmore did not feel like a woman with nowhere to go. She felt like a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Which was, she knew a feeling she was going to have to hold on to very carefully for the next 10 days, because everything that was coming was going to try to take it from her, and she was not going to let it. Pete rode back from Bozeman on the second day with a letter from James Wilson that was 3 pages long and written in the precise, unhurried hand of a man who understood exactly what he was being asked and had decided to answer it fully. Clara read it, standing at the kitchen table with Nathan beside her and Samuel across from her. And as she read, she felt the specific, rare sensation of something that had been very wrong, beginning with great deliberateness to turn right. Wilson had the original documents, all of them. The 1861 bill of sale signed and witnessed. The correspondence between his father Charles and the previous landowner. A survey notation from the original transaction that established the exact boundary lines of the South Quarter. And this was the thing that made Nathan go very still when she read it aloud. A letter from the previous owner, dated 1860, that described a water easement agreement between his property and the adjacent land. An agreement that had been in writing, had been honored for 25 years, and whose terms, if applied to the current situation, made Avery's water rights claim not just legally weak, but factually fraudulent. Avery's land had never had the water access he was claiming. The creek Nathan had diverted was under the original easement terms Nathan's to manage. He knew, Nathan said. When he filed that claim, he knew it was false. He counted on the missing county records, Clara said. Without the original Wilson documents, there was no way to verify the easement terms. He was gambling that your lawyer would settle rather than fight. He was wrong, Samuel said. Nathan was already writing to Marsh. Clara had the second letter to Helena half-drafted in her head. Wilson had agreed to send his records directly to Marsh in Billings by the fastest available courier, and he had enclosed, without being asked, a brief affidavit attesting to the authenticity of the documents and his firm's chain of custody over them since 1861. "This is enough," Nathan said, looking at Wilson's letter. "Not yet," Clara said. "We still need the two ranchers." Nathan rode east that same afternoon. He was back before dark with a man named Gerald Pruitt, who was 60 years old and had the weathered, skeptical expression of someone who has been disappointed by official processes enough times to have stopped expecting them to work. Nathan introduced him to Clara and Samuel in the kitchen, and Gerald Pruitt looked at the table full of documents and said in a flat, careful voice, "You're serious about this?" "We are," Nathan said. "The last time I tried to fight Avery and Crane, I ended up in a hearing where everything I said was either ignored or reframed, and 2 months later the easement was gone, and I was looking at a property line I didn't recognize." He looked at Nathan. "What's different this time?" "We have the original documentation from Wilson's office in Bozeman," Clara said. "We have a pattern, your case, and Caleb Morrison's case, and what they're attempting with this ranch. 3 instances of Crane processing irregular claims against properties adjacent to Avery's land, all within a 6-year period, all involving disputed records from the 1878 fire." She looked at Gerald Pruitt steadily. "1 case is a dispute. 2 cases is a coincidence. 3 cases with overlapping procedural irregularities and the same pair of names is a scheme." Gerald Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Nathan. "She's right," Nathan said simply. "I know she is," Gerald said. "I just want to know if the Territorial Land Office in Helena is actually going to do anything about it, or if we're going to walk into that hearing and watch Crane and Avery run the table again." "Pete rode to Helena 3 days ago," Clara said. "He carried a formal complaint to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office outlining the pattern of irregularities, including the same-day processing of the title review notice and the appointment of an interested party, Avery himself, as hearing adjudicator." She paused. "That last item is the one I believe they will find impossible to ignore." Gerald Pruitt stared at her. He made himself the judge. He did. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My neighbor Caleb Morrison lost 20 acres in that hearing 2 years ago. His wife cried for a week." He looked at Nathan. "I'll testify. Caleb will too if I ask him." "I'd be grateful," Nathan said. Gerald stood and shook Nathan's hand, and then to Clara's mild surprise turned and shook hers as well. "Ma'am," he said with the particular directness of a man extending respect he doesn't offer lightly. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. "Thank you." After he left, Samuel poured coffee for the 3 of them without asking anyone and sat down and said, 7 days. 7 days, Nathan confirmed. "What do we do if Helena doesn't respond in time?" "Then we go into that hearing with everything we have," Nathan said. "And we make the record so complete and so public that whatever Crane decides it becomes undeniable on appeal." Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Helena will respond," she said. "How do you know?" Samuel asked. "Because I addressed the complaint to Commissioner Halverson personally, by name. And I included a specific reference to the territorial code provision that prohibits an interested party from serving as adjudicator in a land title review." She looked at Samuel over her cup. "Men in official positions respond to 2 things reliably: named accountability and cited law." Samuel looked at his son. "Where did she come from?" he said. "Ohio," Nathan said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way that was becoming familiar to her, the way that was almost a smile, and then became one briefly fully before he looked back at his coffee. Clara did not say anything. She drank her coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the evening coming in and thought about the next 7 days with the focused, deliberate attention of a woman who knew that the space between now and Thursday was going to be the most important week of several people's lives. The response from Helena came on the 5th day. Pete rode in with it at noon, and Clara heard him coming and met him at the door, and he was off his horse before it fully stopped and was up the porch steps with the envelope held out in front of him like he understood what it contained. She took it. She made herself walk to the kitchen table before she opened it, because she was not going to rip into it at the front door like someone who hadn't learned how to be steady. Nathan came in from outside while she was reading it. He saw her face. "Good or bad?" he said. She looked up. "Commissioner Halverson is sending a territorial inspector to observe the hearing," she said. "He has issued a formal advisory opinion that the appointment of Thomas Avery as adjudicator is procedurally improper under territorial code and has directed the Willow Creek hearing panel to appoint an independent adjudicator." She paused. "He has also opened a preliminary inquiry into Bill Crane's processing practices over the past 6 years." The kitchen was silent for a full 3 seconds. Then Samuel made a sound she had never heard from him before, a short, sharp exhale that was almost a laugh and was definitely not grief. "Crane," Nathan said. "Crane," Clara confirmed. Nathan sat down slowly. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at the Helena letter, and then at Clara, and then at the table again. "He's going to know we did this. The moment he sees the inspector at the hearing." "He already knows," Clara said. "He's known since he intercepted the Wilson letter. He knows we've been building a case." She set the letter down. "That's why we have 2 days left, and we need to use them well, because Avery is not going to walk into that hearing without trying something." She was right. What Avery tried was Clara herself. He sent a woman named Dorothy Hale, wife of the general store owner, a woman Clara recognized from the whispers on her first day in Willow Creek, to the ranch on the 6th morning, with a message that was phrased as a social call, and was very obviously not one. Clara answered the door because she was the one who always answered the door. Dorothy Hale was a trim woman in her 50s, with a careful face and the particular manner of someone who has been sent to do something she isn't entirely comfortable with, and has decided to do it efficiently and leave. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I've come on behalf of several of the ladies in Willow Creek with a concern about the upcoming hearing." "Mrs. Hale," Clara said, "come in." Dorothy Hale came into the kitchen and declined coffee and stood near the table with her hands folded in front of her in a way that was almost formal. "There are people in this town who are concerned," she said, "that the situation between Mr. Cole and Mr. Avery has been complicated by outside influences." She paused. "They feel that if you were to step back from your involvement in the legal matter, a quieter resolution might be possible." Clara looked at her. "Who specifically is asking me to step back?" Dorothy's eyes moved just slightly. "The community's concern, Mrs. Hale." Clara's voice was very gentle and very clear. "If Thomas Avery has sent you here to ask me to remove myself from this situation, I want you to hear what I'm going to say and take it back to him accurately. I am not a complication in this legal matter. I am a witness to a pattern of fraudulent conduct that has affected at least 3 families in this area. My name is on correspondence that is already in the hands of the Territorial Commissioner's office in Helena. There is no version of me stepping back that changes what has already been set in motion." She held Dorothy Hale's gaze. "I also want you to know that I understand you may have been put in an uncomfortable position by being sent here, and I don't hold that against you personally." Dorothy Hale looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in the woman's face. Something that had been arranged carefully rearranged itself into something more honest. "He said you'd be difficult," she said. "I imagine he did. He said you were—" She stopped. "I know what he said about me," Clara said. "He's been saying it since the day I arrived." Dorothy Hale was quiet. She looked at the kitchen table, at the papers spread across it, at the tin box open near the window. She looked at Clara. "My sister answered one of his advertisements," she said very quietly. 4 years ago, before he married his current wife." She paused. "She came out from Virginia. He turned her away at the station, said she wasn't what he'd expected." She looked at the table. "She went back home. She doesn't go out much anymore." Clara was very still. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought he'd changed," Dorothy said. "When he married Elaine, I thought, but you can't change a man like that. You can only... She stopped again. "You can only make it harder for him to keep doing it," Clara said. Dorothy Hale looked at her. "The hearing is Thursday," Clara said. "The inspector from Helena will be there. Gerald Pruitt and Caleb Morrison will be there. Nathan's attorney will be there with original documentation going back to 1861. She paused. If you wanted to be there too as a member of this community who has reason to understand what's been happening, I think that would be a reasonable decision. Dorothy Hale stood in the kitchen of Cole Ranch for a long moment. She said, "I'll think about it." She left. Samuel appeared from the hallway. "You heard," Clara said. "I heard everything," Samuel said. "Her sister." "Yes." "Avery's done this more than 3 times, Samuel said. "Almost certainly," Clara said. "The land fraud is recent. The other—" She stopped. "The other has been longer." Samuel sat down heavily. "That man has been hurting women in this territory for years, and nobody connected it because each woman thought she was alone." The word landed the way it always did now. Alone. "They were," Clara said. "Until now." Nathan appeared in the doorway back from the barn and saw their faces. "What happened?" Clara told him about Dorothy Hale, about the sister in Virginia, about the 4 years ago that added another case to what was already a pattern that went further back and wider than any of them had understood. Nathan listened to all of it without moving. Then he said, "I want Marsh to know about the sister. It's not directly relevant to the land case. No, but it's relevant to who Thomas Avery is, and I want it on record that his conduct in the land fraud is not the first or the only way he has harmed people in this territory." His voice was steady and utterly serious. "I want all of it in the room on Thursday." She looked at him. "All right. Write to Marsh tonight." "I will." He looked at her for a moment standing in the kitchen doorway, and he said, "Clara, when this is over, Nathan—" She stopped him gently but clearly. "Let's get through Thursday first." He nodded once. "Thursday," he said. Thursday came the way important days always come, with ordinary weather and an unremarkable morning that gave no indication of what it intended to become. Clara made breakfast. She made it the way she made every breakfast, with full attention and no shortcuts, because the discipline of normal things on difficult days was something her mother had taught her, and she had never found a reason to unlearn it. The men ate. Samuel ate 2 full portions and didn't say much, which meant he was bracing himself in the way of a man who has learned to go quiet before something big. Nathan said, "We ride at 9. They rode at 9. All of them. Nathan and Clara and Samuel, who had not been to Willow Creek in 7 months, and got on his horse without a word of complaint. Hector and 3 of the ranch hands, who had asked simply and directly if they could come, and had been told yes. Gerald Pruitt met them at the edge of town with Caleb Morrison beside him, and Caleb Morrison was a man with a scar on his chin and the eyes of someone who has been waiting 2 years for a day like this and is not planning to waste it. Willow Creek had turned out. That was the only way to put it. The hearing was scheduled for the land office, which did not have enough room for what was assembling outside it. People Clara recognized and people she didn't. Ranchers from outside town families she'd never seen. And in the back of the gathered crowd, standing a little apart with her hands clasped in front of her, Dorothy Hale. The territorial inspector was already there, a lean man named Aldrich, with the bearing of someone who had been sent on serious business and intended to conduct it seriously. Bill Crane was there too, behind the land office table, with the ashen face of a man who had walked into a situation he'd calculated incorrectly. Thomas Avery was not yet present. He arrived 10 minutes late, which Clara recognized as intentional. A small power gesture, the entrance of a man who believed the room would wait for him. He came in with 2 other men, one of them a local lawyer, and he surveyed the room with the easy confidence that had apparently carried him through a great deal and was about to run out. He saw Clara. His jaw shifted. She held his gaze without expression. He looked away first. Inspector Aldrich called the hearing to order and stated clearly and for the record that he was present as an observer on behalf of the Territorial Commissioner's office, and that the proceedings would be conducted under standard territorial code with an independent adjudicator in place of the previously appointed panel member. He did not say Avery's name when he said this, but everyone in the room understood, and the understanding moved through the crowd like a current. Avery's lawyer started to object. Aldrich said, "The advisory opinion from Commissioner Halverson has been entered into the record. The objection is noted and overruled." Avery's lawyer sat down. Marsh presented the Wilson documentation first. All of it. He read the 1861 bill of sale into the record. He read the easement agreement. He presented the survey notation. He presented Wilson's affidavit. He was thorough and unhurried, and very, very clear. And with each document the room grew quieter in the specific way rooms grow quiet when something that has been uncertain is becoming certain. Then Gerald Pruitt testified. He was not an eloquent man, but he was a precise one, and precision was what the moment required. He described the 1883 hearing where his easement had been challenged. The same-day processing by Crane. The hearing where his documentation had been dismissed as insufficient. The property line he'd lost. Caleb Morrison testified after him. Same pattern, different property, same names, same procedural irregularities. Crane's face throughout their testimony was the face of a man watching a wall he'd built come apart brick by brick and being unable to stop any of it. Then Marsh called Clara. Avery's lawyer objected immediately, vehemently, with the energy of a man who understood exactly how dangerous her testimony was going to be. The independent adjudicator said, "Objection overruled. The witness will testify." Clara walked to the front of the room. She was aware of how many people were looking at her. She was aware of Avery's eyes on her, hard and calculating. She was aware of Nathan standing near the back wall with his arms crossed and his face still, and his eyes on her with that look that was not pressure but was simply steadiness. Simply, "I'm here." She looked at the adjudicator. She said, "My name is Clara Whitmore. I came to Willow Creek 6 weeks ago on the representation of Thomas Avery, who had offered me a marriage proposal through written correspondence. He did not meet my stagecoach. He left a letter saying he had married another woman." She kept her voice completely even. "In the weeks since I have been employed at Cole Ranch as cook and housekeeper. In that capacity, I have observed, compiled, and assisted in organizing the documentation of a pattern of fraudulent land claims that Mr. Avery has prosecuted, with the assistance of County Land Registrar Crane, against at least 3 properties adjacent to his own over the past 6 years. She then described carefully and chronologically everything she had documented: the water rights claim, the same-day title review notice, the reduction of the review period from 60 days to 10, the appointment of Avery as his own adjudicator, the intercepted correspondence, the connection to Garfield and the debt note, and the pattern, the 3 cases, the overlapping names, the shared procedural signature. When she finished, the room was very quiet. The adjudicator said, "Mr. Avery, do you wish to respond to this testimony?" Avery stood. He was still carrying the easy confidence, but it was smaller now, compressed a thing that had been taking up a great deal of space and was discovering that space was no longer available to it. "This woman," Avery said, "has a personal grievance against me that is coloring her account of events. She arrived in this territory under false pretenses. She, Mr. Avery." The adjudicator's voice was patient and final. "The documentation presented today is not Miss Whitmore's account of events. It is an 1861 bill of sale, a witnessed easement agreement, a survey notation, a notarized affidavit, and the sworn testimony of 2 additional property owners. If you wish to challenge specific documents, please instruct your counsel to do so. If you wish to characterize the witness's personal history, that is not relevant to these proceedings." Avery's lawyer leaned in and said something low and urgent. Avery sat down. Inspector Aldrich stepped forward. "For the record," he said, "the Territorial Commissioner's Office will be conducting a full review of all land claims processed by County Registrar Crane over the past 6 years. Mr. Crane, you are hereby notified that your processing authority is suspended pending that review." He looked at Crane. "You are also advised to obtain legal counsel." Crane's face was ash-colored and completely still. "Furthermore," Aldrich said, "the title review of the Cole Ranch South Quarter is hereby suspended pending the outcome of the Commissioner's investigation, and the water rights claim filed by Mr. Avery is referred for independent review in light of the easement documentation presented today." He closed his folder. "This hearing is concluded." The room erupted. Not loudly. It was not that kind of crowd, but in the particular way of people who have been holding tension for a long time and are letting it out all at once in a dozen different quiet conversations. Gerald Pruitt grabbed Nathan's hand and shook it. Caleb Morrison said something short and heartfelt that Clara didn't catch, but that made Nathan nod with the full weight of his attention. Hector put his hat back on and grinned, which was the first time she had seen Hector grin. Avery left quickly. He did not look at her on his way out. He did not need to. Whatever he was feeling, it was not something he was going to show in public, and whatever was coming for him from the territorial investigation was something he was going to have to face, whether he showed it or not. Samuel reached her before Nathan did. He took her hand in both of his, the way old men do with people they have decided are worth holding on to, and he said, "Ruth would have liked you enormously." Clara pressed her free hand over his. She could not speak for a moment. "I would have liked her," she managed. He squeezed her hand and let go, and Nathan was there. He stood in front of her, and the room was still doing its busy, complicated thing around them, but between the two of them, it was completely quiet. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "Clara." "I told you to wait until Thursday," she said. "It's Thursday." She looked at him. "It is." He said, "I'm not going to say something in the middle of the Willow Creek land office." "Good," she said, "because I'm not going to answer something in the middle of the Willow Creek land office." Something moved across his face that was fully, completely a smile. Not the almost, the real thing. She had not seen it until right now, and it rearranged his entire face into something that she was going to be thinking about for a considerable amount of time. "Supper tonight," he said. "Supper tonight," she agreed. They rode back to the ranch together, the way they had ridden into town, Nathan and Clara and Samuel with Hector, and the men around them with Gerald Pruitt and Caleb Morrison riding east and tipping their hats as the road split with the Montana sky, doing its enormous, indifferent, breathtaking thing above all of them. Samuel rode beside Clara for a while and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of saying something. At the ranch before anyone had unsaddled Clara, stood for a moment at the fence line near the kitchen garden, and looked at the house. The house that had been cold when she arrived. The house that had smelled of absence and old grief, and the particular staleness of rooms nobody had felt comfortable in for a long time. It didn't smell like that anymore. She had noticed it gradually, the way you notice a shift in weather. Not at the moment it changes, but sometime after when you realize the change has been real for a while, and you simply hadn't stopped to name it. She heard Nathan behind her. He came and stood beside her at the fence line, and they looked at the house together, and he said, "I want to tell you something." "All right. The morning I saw you on that platform, before I knew anything." He was looking at the house, but she could hear him choosing each word the way he chose everything. "I saw a woman who had just been handed the worst kind of news and was not going to let anyone see it destroy her." He paused. "I knew right then that you were the kind of person I had stopped believing existed. The kind that doesn't need the world to be kind to them in order to keep being kind to it." He turned to look at her. "I didn't bring you here because I needed a cook." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "You knew." "I suspected," she said. "And then I knew." "When?" She thought about it honestly. "When you put bread on my plate because I'd been serving everyone else and my plate was still half empty." She held his gaze. "A man doesn't notice that about a woman unless he's paying real attention." Nathan was quiet. "I have been paying attention since the first minute," he said. She took a breath. "I know this has been fast. I know I've only been here 6 weeks. I know you've been through something that doesn't just finish because time passes, and I know I've been through things that made me careful in ways I'm still learning to understand." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not in a hurry. I'm not going anywhere. And I am not afraid of building something slowly if it's being built right." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I'm not asking you to hurry." "Good. I'm asking you to stay." The words were so simple and so complete that she didn't try to find something equal to them. She said, "I'm staying." He reached out and took her hand and held it, and that was all, and it was exactly enough. That evening at supper, Samuel told a story about Ruth that he had never told before. Something small and funny and utterly specific, the kind of memory that lives in the very bottom of a person's chest and only comes up when they're finally warm enough for it to rise. Nathan laughed at the end of it. A real laugh, full and unguarded, and the sound of it in that kitchen in that house was something Clara knew she was going to carry with her for the rest of her life. After the dishes were done and the stove was banked and the house was quiet, she went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the windowsill where Thomas Avery's letter had been sitting for 6 weeks. She picked it up. She didn't reread it. She folded it one last time, very small, and held it in her hand for a moment, and thought about everything that had followed from it. The platform, the stew, the table where a lonely old man remembered how to talk the letters, and the tin box, and the hearing, and the smile she had finally seen. She thought about being not alone. Then she put the letter in the cold ash of the small fireplace in her room and struck a match and watched it go. Clara Whitmore had come to Montana with one suitcase and a broken promise and nowhere left to go. She left that version of herself in the ash where it belonged, and in the morning she got up before the sun and lit the stove and started the coffee and began with both hands and her whole heart the life that had been waiting for her all along.